And now enjoy this free Jason Modcast show.
What are you? I'm Batman.
Who are you?
My name is Bond. I'm Batman.
Name's Bond.
James Bond.
I'm Batman.
Bond. James Bond. I'm Batman.
I'm Batman.
This is the Batman vs. James Bond show. The show covering everything related to Batman and James Bond movies. And now, here's your host, Brian Thomas.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to an all-new episode of the Batman vs. James Bond show. The name's Thomas, Brian Thomas, and I am your host. And this is the show where we discuss everything related to Batman and James Bond movies. It is great to be back. I hope all of you had a great week. To all the listeners in the U.S., I hope you enjoyed your 4th of July extended weekend. I know I did. Some much-needed staycation/vacation with the family, catching up and stuff like that. Maybe you watched even the Batman v Superman Ultimate Cut multiple times, or you had a James Bond marathon of your own. I don't know if there was any James Bond marathons out there this week, and if there wasn't, shame on them. But if you're like me, you own the Blu-ray set, so you can just watch them over and over again. Anyway, right now at the time of recording, we are just 25 days until the premiere of Suicide Squad. So if I haven't said it already, I'm really excited about this movie. I'm really, really excited about this movie. As a matter of fact, this easily is my most anticipated movie of the year. It might be even more than Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice was, and I know, shame on me because I'm a Batman fan. However, this is, in a way, a Batman movie, but we're just going to be seeing it from a different perspective. I'll talk about that in a moment because I'd like to tease you. The reason for that is mainly because we've never had a movie like this because, I mean, let's face it, we've had villains, we've seen, even in Batman movies, sometimes the villain might be highlighted a little bit more than it might have even more screen time than, say, Batman. But like I said, this is a different kind of a superhero movie. So, and it looks like it is kind of more fun. And I mean, all the cast, I could talk about this forever. I could do a whole episode of this, which I probably will do one day. But, where I'm going with this anyway is, as a part of the countdown, I've decided to do a 2-part villains episode featuring all the big baddies from the Batman and James Bond movies. Yeah, I said it, all Batman baddies and all James Bond baddies out there. What I'm going to do is share my thoughts on them, and as always, I want your feedback on this. So, before we get things started here, before we start having some real fun, I would like to remind everybody to please subscribe to the Batman vs. James Bond show on Spreaker and or iTunes, and leave a nice little review for me on there. Thank you. So, as I always like to mention, especially for the new listeners, welcome. I am not a movie critic. I am not a movie blogger for a movie site. Maybe one day. I'm just a guy who is obsessed with Batman and James Bond movies. Clearly, if you haven't seen my Instagram, then at Batman vs. Bond, head over there. I have a whole bunch of good content over there. Whatever I don't get a chance to talk about on here, I always post on there. So before I forget, I do want to give everybody like an update of what's to come this month. Obviously, like I said, I'm going to be doing a 2-part villains episode. All the best baddies out there, or best villains of James Bond and Batman. After that, immediately, I'm going to be doing San Diego Comic-Con coverage for 2016. Obviously, going to be more Batman and Batman-related, Justice League-related news coming out of there. Not so much, if at all, James Bond news, but I will have something for the James Bond fans, as always. Also, right after that comes Batman: The Killing Joke. Now, I was able to snag tickets to that to see that in theaters. I will be watching that, and then I will be posting a review immediately after that. And then right after that, it's actually going to be Suicide Squad, and that'll be right at the beginning of August. So, and of course, I'll be doing a Suicide Squad review, probably some spoilers in there, but I will give you more further details later on. So, like I said, very full month of things to come, and I'm really excited about this. Like I said, we're only a month away, or only 25 days from Suicide Squad. Batman Killing Joke's right around the corner. San Diego Comic-Con. I mean, it's all coming together. It's just all this stuff at one time. It's like Christmas all of a sudden, and I'm really excited. I'm all hyped up for this. So before we get started right into the villain segment, I did want to mention that a little bit of Suicide Squad news that did come out. We have a better detailed plot synopsis that came out. This is courtesy of Entertainment Weekly. Everybody's been asking, when is Suicide Squad going to be set? Is it going to be happening after the events of Man of Steel? Is it going to be at the same time as Batman v Superman? It's actually going to be after Batman v Superman's event. So here you go. Here's your plot synopsis. Suicide Squad takes place in a post-Superman world following the events of Dawn of Justice, as the government grapples with how to respond to the next time an alien visits Earth with less noble intentions than the Man of Steel. The answer, according to ruthless intelligent officer Amanda Waller, played by Viola Davis, is to recruit society's most vile criminals armed with lethal skills and superhuman powers. Her first target is possessed archaeologist June Moon, aka Enchantress, is played by Cara Delevingne. I always pronounce that wrong. Waller's program doesn't get a green light, though, until Midway City is threatened by a powerful mystical enemy, and Waller needs to activate the whole squad of prisoners. The baddies get a break. Deadshot, played by Will Smith, has his Second Amendment rights reinstated. Harley, played by Margot Robbie, is carefully excised from her birdcage. Diablo, played by Jay Hernandez, is released from his own fireproof fortress of solitude. Boomerang, played by Jai Courtney, and Slipknot, played by Adam Beach, strap their weapons back on. And Killer Croc, I can never pronounce this name right, I'm sorry. Adewale Akanu Ajibaj is popped from his swamp. The one condition for the restricted freedom: obey orders or die. A rule strictly enforced by squad leader Rick Flag, played by Joel Kinnaman, his samurai katana, played by Karen Fukuhara, and the explosive devices inserted into their neck courtesy of Wayne Enterprise. Throwing a wrench into all these plans is the tatted Gotham City arch criminal, the Joker, played by Jared Leto, and his laser-like plan to reunite with his true love, Harley, mission by Damned. But a funny thing happens while these scumbags try to become heroes. They each must absolve themselves of their crimes, even if society won't. And that's where it gets interesting. A layer of humanity and sadness resides underneath these characters' stories as they each grapple with whether they can be redeemed. Whew, that's a heck of a synopsis right there. Anyway, so, some things we do know, and it falls into spoiler territory about, Batman's involvement. Obviously, Batman's going to be having more of a cameo in here as well. It has been released, possibly who the main baddie could be in here. I don't want to talk about it yet because if you're like me, I don't want spoilers. I want to be fresh. They've been doing, when I say they, Warner Brothers DC Comics has been doing such a great job of keeping everything. They keep their trailers, marketing department is amazing with how they've been cutting their trailers. Advance tickets go on sale this upcoming Friday. Make sure you buy them. We have still little to no details. The synopsis is great. It gives us a little bit more about what's going on. Sounds like they're going to be having some flashbacks in there, and it's going to be still character driven. We also know that we're going to be seeing David Ayer described this in an interview saying that, we've seen Batman movies where we see it through Batman's eyes and then we see how he looks at the villains. This is going to be how the villains, see Batman, and obviously he's going to be pretty freaking scary. So there you have it. That's the synopsis. Like I said, there's more details out there, but I'll be posting it on the website. Feel free to read it if you want to be, if you want to know more about going into the movie. I will put the spoiler warning out there. Anyway, let's hop into the villain special. I don't want to, hold this back anymore. I'm really excited about this, so let's get right into it. All right, villains. Everybody, who doesn't love a villain, by the way? It's fun to root for the good guy. I know I do all the time, but sometimes it's something about a villain. If you have the right villain, the right adversary for the hero, it's something about them. And sometimes, it's okay to root for the bad guy. And that's why I'm looking forward also to Suicide Squad. So, and when I look at a James Bond movie, especially, and a Batman movie, it's just okay, well, some of these villains always steal the show. So let's start with one of the most iconic villains of all time. Probably the villain that kicked it off, at least for the James Bond universe. The movie was Dr. No. He actually had his name in there. It wasn't James Bond #1. It was Dr. No. Dr. Julius No, played by Joseph Wiseman. Yeah, let's talk about this guy. So, my memory of this was, well, of course, I wasn't born in 1962, so I didn't get a chance to see this on the big screen. Dr. No wasn't my first James Bond movie, but I actually thought that Dr. No, because at the time, all the Austin Powers movies were out, I thought Dr. No was supposed to be what Blofeld looked like. And by my surprise, when I saw Dr. No, I'm like, you don't look who I thought you would look like. So, but anyway, Dr. No, a very interesting villain. Of course, it's kind of like a, one of those movies, I would describe it almost to the Jaws effect, where everybody's afraid of this villain. We hear his name and we don't, even Felix Leiter described him as okay, well, we don't know much about him except his name, Dr. No. And it was so great because you have such all this time, he's in the background. You hear his voice, and he's, giving his henchman, the Spider, for example, to plan at James Bond's bed. And, all these people are willing to die for him. And we still haven't seen him until like nearly 3/4 into the movie, maybe even more than that. And when we finally see him, and he's just like this, he's just eerie looking. And it's not, even if he has this power, and not, I wouldn't say power, but his hands, he has these black leather gloves on, and, when he crushes some kind of metal paperweight or whatever that was at the dinner table when he's talking to James Bond, and he introduces, I'm a part of Spectre. And it was just such a great thing. And him and James Bond, it's funny because he admires James Bond for who James Bond is. He's obviously one of the greatest spies, in the world. And, he brought James Bond to his lair to say, oh, Mr. Bond, I hope that, that you would respect or you would admire what I'm doing. And, world domination. Let me try it this way. World domination, same old dream. And, it's just great that the little back and forth that these guys have, it's just like you didn't need to have any action with these two. It's just, okay, well, just the lines in itself were great. And Dr. No, like I said, I think he kind of defined what a James Bond villain would be to come. I mean, because I don't know what villains were like at that time. Of course, we have seen him. We've heard about him in the books. We've heard about him in the comic books even too. But to see something like this be brought to life, I bet it was a big treat for, especially at that time. So, is Dr. No one of the best Bond villains? I would definitely say no, but I would definitely say that it was always entertaining going back to this movie. And just, if you haven't seen this movie, definitely go see this movie. It's the first James Bond movie. It wasn't the first James Bond book. That was Casino Royale, which we'll come to in the second part of Villains. But I will end off on this saying that, you have to think about, like I said, 1962, when this came out, nothing really, to my recollection, had came out at this time. And, it's just, you really have to, as the saying goes, respect the past and embrace the future. Definitely respect this movie. Definitely respect this villain, because he definitely said he was kind of a template of what's to come. So let's move on here to From Russia with Love. One of the main villains in here, and you could definitely classify him as a henchman, but I think he was more than that. I would classify him more as the main villain as opposed to the other one that we'll talk about in a second. Red Grant, played by Robert Shaw. Yes, Robert Shaw was in Jaws, the movie, not Jaws, the villain. We'll talk about him a little later. So this was an interesting villain because, okay, so you have the second James Bond movie. How do you obviously the stakes are being raised with this. The opening sequence, even with this, is you actually have him versus Sean Connery, or who we think is James Bond. It ends up not being James Bond, and he uses his watch, and it's Spectre being Spectre. You're at a Spectre training facility, and what a treat this was, because, it's how Spectre's planning to get revenge on James Bond. They set such a great plan, but this villain was really good. And one of the things, of course, I liked is what he did with the watch and how he was able to choke out James Bond. Not that I'm so much into that. It's just that it was very clever in that we start seeing more gadgets not being used just by James Bond, by being used by the adversaries in there too. So one of my favorite scenes with Red Grant, of course, is that, he, of course, is moving in the background, but we did get to see him right away. Now, when he and James Bond finally meet, they don't know. Red Grant obviously knows who James Bond is. James Bond doesn't know who Red Grant is at the time. However, when they're on the train and they're getting dinner, and then right after that, they meet again, and, they do the whole, fish and red wine. Apparently that's how James Bond was able to tell that something was going on, and, the Red Grant might have been, possibly Spectre and so forth. And, Red Grant pulls this he keeps pulling this line. He just keeps calling James Bond old man. Now, old man, you will kiss my feet. And it was amazing, because he has James Bond in the ultimate spot right here. He's just like, okay, well, James Bond, you're pretty much going to kiss my ass, because I'm going to kill you, but you're going to kiss my feet. And I have you, the world's greatest super spy, at my feet, and I can do whatever I want with you. I have my gun, I have my silencer, and there's nobody that can come save you, and so forth. So it was some great banter between both of them. I really enjoyed that train scene. I definitely, and like I say, always respect the past, embrace the future. I'm going to keep saying that. Red Grant will probably set like almost if Dr. No set a template for the main baddies, then Red Grant would set a template for more of the henchmen of what's to come, because you see when he's at the Spectre training facility, you have Rosa Caleb hit him with brass knuckles in the gut, and he doesn't even flinch. And to me, that's like, okay, well, this is going to be not just like a normal Bond movie or just not a normal henchman, because, James Bond, he's not like the ultimate fighter. If James Bond punches this guy, it's obviously it's going to be a hell of a fight anyway. So Red Grant, definitely a great villain. Now, actually, the main villain of this was probably going to be Colonel Rosa Klebb, played by Lot Lenya. I think I pronounced that correctly. Lot Lenya. There we go. Anyway, so it wasn't quite Rosa Klebb's plan, but she was like kind of like the mastermind, her and the guy that played chess at the very beginning. I believe he was number 3. And, they brought this idea to number 1, which is technically, well, there's no technically about it. It is Blofeld, but they don't actually give his name at the time, so they just called him number 1. But if you're a reader of the books, then you know exactly who he is, and he's feeding Siamese fighting fish to his cat and so forth. And you could even say he's the main baddie in this, but for all intents and purposes, we will just say that it is Colonel Klebb. She's the one who goes to Russia. She recruits the Russian what's her name, Tatiana, and gets her to try to kind of play with James Bond and kind of seduce him and so forth. They get it on video, and I don't want to give away too much of the movie, but I just want to look at the character. This lady was so tough. I mean, she was really just like, okay, I do not want to be on her, I don't want to even be near her, even though on a good day, because she's, obviously she's walking through the Spectre training facility. They're trying to light guys on fire. They're trying to shoot them as they're, going through these obstacles and so forth. She even hits, Red Grant with the brass knuckles. I'll keep coming back to that. And it's like, okay, well, that's great, but, I'm not totally impressed, but you'll do, and so forth. And at the very end, she even, gets to the point where she just sneaks up on 007, and she goes to his hotel room, and, she's posing as a maid and so forth. And it ends up being where she, thinks she's got him, but ends up being, she gets shot at the very end. Spoiler alert there. But, the coolest part about that, though, was that her shoe, it had like the knife that came out of it. That's definitely probably one of the cooler classic gadgets out there, and it wasn't even one of James Bond's, that ended up showing up again in Die Another Day in the Q gadget scene. Anyway, I thought that was a really cool scene there too. But, Colonel Rosa Klebb, sometimes I would say she doesn't get enough credit, but I mean, cause she was like one of the first, if not, she'd probably be the first villainess that we've ever seen on screen in a James Bond movie. I don't know about movie history. I'm sure there's been other female villainesses out there and so forth, but at least in these movies, I would say she is. So anyway, Colonel Rosa Klebb, if you haven't checked out From Russia with Love, go check that out. Great movie. All right, moving on here. Now, this one, I will probably say is probably one of the top villains of all time in a James Bond movie, in the James Bond movies. I will say he's probably in my top 3. I don't know if he makes my favorite, but I really, really love this villain. Or Goldfinger, played by Gert Frobe. I think I pronounced that correctly. Goldfinger. He's the man with the Midas touch. Okay, I sang. Yeah, I did it. Anyway, all right, Goldfinger. I'll say it right now. Goldfinger is probably what makes Goldfinger so interesting to me and to a lot of other people, I think, is that, one, he has no connections with Spectre and any other organization, okay? Goldfinger is a selfish villain. All he cares about is gold, obviously, as his name states. He is not after world domination, and that makes him even more interesting to me. What is his plan? Well, if you've seen Goldfinger, then you know where I'm going with this. For those of you that haven't seen it, then pause this, watch it, and then come right back to this. So Goldfinger's plan is to blow up Fort Knox, and the purpose of he's not going into Fort Knox to steal the gold. He's going up there to detonate a nuclear weapon or a bomb to destroy the value of the gold, so it increases the price of his gold. How about that for a plan? And, it's just, okay, Goldfinger, you are very clever. James Bond, he had James Bond over to his farm in Kentucky. He tells him his plan, and James Bond is completely wowed by this. He's like, I forget how James Bond exactly said it, but my compliments, Goldfinger. That is just most impressive. Something to that extent, anyway. And, it's just like, when you can wow James Bond with your master plan, then you obviously are doing something correctly. Goldfinger, I mean, he obviously, if Dr. No didn't set the template for the big baddies of at least the James Bond universe, and maybe even villains in general, Batman and other villains out there. I mean, Goldfinger, even in the movie, going off track here, Wolf of Wall Street, you have a villain such that Leonardo DiCaprio played, and at his wedding they played the theme to Goldfinger. He compared himself to a Bond villain, and in a way it's just like, okay, well, you can see the comparisons that they're making here even to this day, all the way over in 2013. Goldfinger is still relevant. It is still probably one of the most highly praised James Bond movies. Came out in 1964. And, everybody keeps coming to this as one of the definitive James Bond movies. It's not just because of the Aston Martin and the gadgets. Of course, the beautiful Bond women in there, but Goldfinger, I think, is just the one. Another great scene in Goldfinger, real quick, is when him and James Bond are golfing together, and Goldfinger cheats. He has Oddjob as his caddy, and, he loses his ball, but the ball magically appears, and, it's just so great. They're betting over a thing of gold that, James Bond doesn't even own. It belongs to the government, and somehow James Bond is able to pull something out of his ass, and he still wins, and it was such a great scene. They know who each other are. Bond knows that he killed Jill Masterson, but, oh well, I'm still going to play Goldfinger's game, and I better win, and so forth, and I'm going to keep tracking him. But what a great, great movie. What a great baddie. Like I said, sometimes I think that maybe Goldfinger could be one of the top villains of, at least in the James Bond universe. Like I said, for now, I'm probably going to put him at least in the top 2, top 3. So, let me know what you think about that. Goldfinger wouldn't be Goldfinger, though, however, without his henchman. One of the ultimate henchmen, Oddjob, played by Harold Sakata. I think I pronounced that correctly. Oddjob is, if Goldfinger was the definitive villain, then Oddjob is the definitive henchman. Red Grant was great, don't get me wrong, but, Oddjob wasn't a big guy, but he had that hat, and when he threw that hat and it broke the neck of, some people, Jill Masterson's, sister, and he broke the statue. I mean, that scene right there, when he breaks the statue, Oddjob. And he just he points to the statue, he breaks the statue's head off, and so forth. And, 007 makes the comment, well, what's the, club head gonna say? Oh, nothing. I own the club. And Oddjob never says anything but, like that. And Oddjob didn't need to say anything. That was so great about Oddjob, because he just dresses in this little suit all the time. He wears the top hat, and, that's it. That's all he needs is that hat. Once again, with Oddjob, he's one of those villains where you hit and, 007 could hit him in the face. Didn't matter. Oddjob will just, turn his head, come back with a little grin on his face. Maybe he doesn't smile. He just grins the whole time. When that fight that he had at the end when they were in Fort Knox, it's actually James Bond trying to throw his hat at Oddjob. It gets stuck in some bars, and then all of a sudden, James Bond outsmarts him and throws the electric cable in there and shocks him. And that's pretty much the only line that you get out of Oddjob, aside from he's actually screaming because, of course, when you're being electrocuted, what else could happen? So, yeah, Oddjob, we will put him, at least I'll rank him right now as at least number 2 for henchman villains. I'll talk about whom I think my other number 1 could be. I'm always back and forth with that, because whenever I come back to these movies, I'm just like, oh, what a great henchman, what a great villain that was, and so forth. So, moving on here, Emilio Largo. Let's talk about Thunderball. Yeah, Thunderball. I'm not going to sing the Tom Jones song, but I will talk a little bit about Emilio Largo, who was played by Adolfo Celi. This guy was a great villain. How do you follow Goldfinger? Well, you go back to Spectre, and you have number 2 devise a plan to steal some nuclear warheads, and then, he's going to cause some kind of a war and so forth. And, Largo was definitely one of those villains that, he might not be everybody's favorite villain. I definitely, thought he was a great villain. He was a great adversary to James Bond. him and James Bond have those lines. He does the whole invite 007 to his lair and so forth, invite him to the ship. 007 falls for his girl and so forth. But Largo was definitely more of a physical villain as opposed to other villains that we've had before. Dr. No, him and James Bond got in a fight before. Goldfinger, him and James Bond did before. But, Largo was more of a hands-on kind of a villain. He was always out there, doing the diving scenes. His thing was, he would throw his, try to throw somebody to his 2 pet sharks. Definitely something we will see later on when it comes to, villains and having their animals or their pets and trying to throw their henchmen in there when their henchmen have failed. Largo overall, though, I think he was a great villain. When you think of, Spectre and I always think of this. I mean, the eye patch on the eye, his quote when he's playing James Bond at cards, "You appear to be unbeatable, Mr. Bond." And, just those quotes and just his expressions and so forth. He was very fearless. He never feared. He always knew, he always was confident, I guess, that he was going to be able to carry out his plan. He saw James Bond more as like that nuisance, that little bug that's in the way. I know who I'm dealing with here. And, I need to outsmart him, and I will outsmart him, and so forth. So, definitely Emil Largo, definitely a great villain. Just for the record here, I know I might be skipping over some villains, maybe, or some henchmen anyway. It's for time purposes. Just because I forgot them doesn't mean that I don't care about them. It's just that I'm trying to cram as much in here as I possibly can. So, like I said, let me know what your favorite villains and henchmen are, and whatever ones I did forget. Anyway, moving on here. You Only Live Twice. The main baddie finally shows his face. Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Donald Pleasance ends up being the face of Blofeld, this main baddie, number 1 that's been teased for all this time, for all these years and so forth. Probably it was only teased about for maybe 5 years, but in the books, you try to picture somebody, and when you finally see that villain on screen, what do you think they're going to end up looking like? And obviously when they were showing Blofeld before, we always saw him with the cat. They definitely threw the cat in here. In this case, he ended up being bald. He had that scar on his eye, and just the voice and so forth was a little different. But, to me, Ernst Stavro Blofeld in himself, the character, is the iconic James Bond villain. You can take that to the bank. Blofeld is the main adversary for James Bond. Always will be, always has been. I will say this, that Donald Pleasance definitely set the template for what Blofeld, in my mind, has always come to look like. I mean, sure, everybody can picture, just, a guy in the suit stroking the white pussycat and so forth, but it was something about Donald Pleasance, when he was on screen, how he was acting with James Bond, he just, like I said, even how, Largo was with James Bond, he was kind of in the same sense saying, okay, I know James Bond is, he is like the main person who's always in my way. He's that secret agent that I can't seem to kill. You only live twice, Mr. Bond. You can all watch it on TV. It's the last thing you ever get to watch. And, just those comments on there and in the movie and so forth. And when he finally shows up in the missile silo, or the hidden volcano layer that Blofeld had, it was just probably the best part of the movie in my mind, because just how he treats 007, it won't be the nicotine that kills you, Mr. Bond, and stuff like that. I just loved, and just his voice, just how his expressions were and so forth. Obviously his main thing was world domination. I mean, he doesn't care how many people he kills. He doesn't care, if it means just like stealing missiles or nuclear warheads, if it means stealing space shuttles and so forth, or causing wars. That's what makes Blofeld Blofeld. He doesn't even care about his, people. He doesn't care about his henchmen or anything like that. He is so self-centered and just, I don't care about anything aside from either killing 007, what my next plan is going to be. That's what makes Blofeld Blofeld, and probably I will put him as number 1. He is the definitive James Bond villain. So, as for Donald Pleasance and how he portrayed him, some people might not like him. I think that, I would have liked to seen more of Donald Pleasance. Maybe not just in the movie. I think they did it. I think I liked how they did it. You always have that build up, kind of like how they did with Dr. No, the build up, you kind of see him and you hear him, you hear him speak. And then it wasn't until like 3/4 of the movie that you finally see him and so forth. And that ends up being a thing throughout James Bond movies. I do like it. I wish Donald Pleasance would have come back in the next movie. The next movie, obviously moving on here, is On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Ernest Stavro Blofeld returns, but it ends up being Telly Savalas that plays him, and you have a new actor portraying James Bond, that being George Lazenby. What I read is that the producers wanted more of a physical, Blofeld, and Telly Savalas was able to do that more than Donald Pleasance was, and so forth, so that's why they ended up going with that. But they still have it as being, Telly Savalas is, Telly Savalas was a great Blofeld. He really was. The more I watch On Her Majesty's Secret Service, I will say that, I do love how he portrayed Blofeld and so forth. I don't know. I think that with Blofeld, though, I think that Telly Savalas wasn't as scary to me as Donald Pleasance was. Donald Pleasance was really kind of scary, kind of freaky, just his personality really didn't even blink. Telly Savalas is just kind of more of a cooler, not laid back, but he's kind of like, yeah, I'm Blofeld, I know I'm gonna, that the British government and so forth, any government can't touch me and so forth. I'm gonna carry out this plan and so forth. And you know what? Because why? I'm Blofeld and I'm the head of Spectre and I can do what I want. So, what he did with James Bond, obviously what makes this one a little bit more personal is obviously that he killed James Bond's wife, Tracy. And I think that's what puts him a little bit higher in the chain of being a more evil Blofeld. But it wasn't actually him that killed her. It was actually his henchman, and her name always escapes me and so forth. But so Blofeld in this movie, I think he was really good. We'll talk about, how I ranked all the Blofelds. Obviously, right now I just said Donald Pleasance is my favorite Blofeld, but, there might be another one that I might like a little bit just as much. We'll see. All right, so moving on here, keeping with the Blofeld theme here, because Blofeld was the main baddie for all these last 3 James Bond movies. Diamonds Are Forever. Ernest Stavro Blofeld returned, but once again, it ends up being a different actor. It ends up being actor Charles Gray. And James Bond ends up changing again with the actor, and it ends up being the return of Sean Connery. Now, let's look past all the facts of, and this is one thing that I tried to get away from you mentioning, but, the continuation of how were they going to do, how do you continue a story where you just killed James Bond's wife, and then you're bringing on the original James Bond actor? Well, they bring him back and so forth, but they don't really go into that story so much, which I was very disappointed in, and every time I watch that, I keep hoping that it's going to be something different, but you kind of got to go with it, and so forth, and Blofeld, when you see an actor who's, playing the bad guy from the previous movies and he ends up looking different, that makes it harder for me to adjust also, because you have this picture of, ingrained in your mind, and for me, it's always going to be Donald Pleasance, and, when you see Charles Gray, it's like, oh, well, Blofeld, how'd you get hair all of a sudden? Did you go to a gene therapy or something like that? And Charles Gray was just... he was more comedic with his approach to Blofeld, and, whether it's the cross-dressing and just his little quirky comments, showing a little bit more cheek there and so forth. And, I think Charles Gray's approach is just like, it follows the whole theme of Diamonds Are Forever, which is another discussion for another day. But having said that, I will say that it was funny. He was a funny Blofeld, if that makes sense. I think that's what they were going for. There was obviously more comedy in Diamonds Are Forever. How him and James Bond were, it's just like, I don't know. Like I said, if they would have continued the theme that they did with On Her Majesty's Secret Service, then I think that, and, it would have made it better. Having said that, Charles Gray, not my favorite Blofeld, probably one of my least favorite, villains in general. I mean, if you're talking about the character of Blofeld, like I keep saying, he's my number one, literally, not just because they call him number one. If you're talking about just Charles Gray playing a villain, I will say he's probably at the bottom of the food chain. So, there you have it. Moving on. So, we're going into Live and Let Die. We're going into the Roger Moore era. Roger Moore, his approach on James Bond's obviously going to be different, as are the villains that he's going to be dealing with. This first outing that he had, was versus a drug dealer, a heroin dealer, and so forth, and it ends up being Dr. Kananga, aka Mr. Big, played by Yaphet Kotto. Now, looking at all this, like I said, you have a new James Bond, so that took a little bit of a getting used to and so forth. But overall, with the villain, what made Dr. Kananga really interesting is kind of like a Goldfinger, is that he's not after world domination. He's just after making money and selling drugs and so forth. Something we'd never seen yet in a James Bond movie. It seemed in a way that Dr. Kananga, aka Mr. Big, was always one step ahead of Bond. James Bond, his reputation precedes him and so forth, but when you put 007 in New York and you put him in Harlem, it makes it a little bit more interesting because Mr. Big, Dr. Kananga, that's his turf, and that's kind of being in his lair to a point. He didn't have like any special secret lair. Sure, he was kind of on an island. He had his mansion there and so forth, but whenever 007 went to whether it was New York or if it was New Orleans and so forth, Dr. Kananga was always prepared for him, whether it was at the restaurants and so forth. And I think that, Dr. Kananga, I liked what he did with, or what Yaphet Kotto did with that villain. I don't think I ever feared for James Bond in general. I feared more for Solitaire, because I always thought that, Solitaire was going to be, the one to get it at the very end, but, luckily she lived and so forth. But, Dr. Kananga, I did like him. I won't say he's my favorite, but I did enjoy his presence as a villain in there, and so forth. So, moving on. He did have a cool henchman in there, and he's never really mentioned too much. It was Teehee, played by Julius Harris. Like I said, something that makes a henchman in general is, especially in the James Bond world, is he strong? Can he take a beating? Does he have some kind of special power? And I won't say this is a special power, but Teehee was missing an arm because obviously it was bitten off by the crocodile alligator. And, he replaced it with a mechanical arm or kind of a claw. And this claw has the power to, just bend the Walther PPK and so forth. And it was about to, it could clip fingers off or whatever and so forth. But, Teehee, he was, this falls into the whole Roger Moore era of, the more comedic approach. And, Teehee, had some fun with 007 and, so forth. But I did like Teehee. Hey, Mr. Bond, it's nice to see you again. And then he goes after him on the train and so forth. But, he definitely underrated, but, definitely a good henchman. Maybe not my favorite once again, but I did like him. All right. So moving on here. We move into The Man with the Golden Gun. This is always a very controversial Bond film in the way, because a lot of people say it's not the best Bond film, but I will take this and say that, you did have a great villain, especially what he had to work with. I'm talking about Francisco Scaramanga, the man with the golden gun himself, Christopher Lee. Yeah, so I always look at this film just like, when I first saw it, I was just like, okay, the man with the golden gun, showdown versus, with this guy who only takes one shot with this little funny looking gun, a golden gun, that is. And, he could kill James Bond at any time. And, he has fun with James Bond, and he puts James Bond in these scenarios where he kills like the man right next to James Bond. He kills the woman that that he had slept with. And then all of a sudden, they're showing up at a boxing match, and a gun with a bag of peanuts. What would they think of next? Just to that extent anyway. So when, he has Knick-Knack there, and he's pointing the golden gun at James Bond, and I think my favorite part about Scaramanga is that we've never had a villain. We have villains that are fascinated with James Bond, that admire him, and then villains that just feel that James Bond poses no threat. Scaramanga knows in the end how good James Bond really is. So to bring James Bond to your lair, to your little island there, and have a showdown with his Walther PPK and one bullet out of your golden gun, and just like the classic, kind of a Titans match and so forth. I do really enjoyed that. Scaramanga himself, the character, he wasn't so much comedic. He had fun with, or Christopher Lee, you could tell, had fun with the part. Like I said, made the most out of it that he could. I would say he's very memorable. And I'm looking aside from the movie, of course, but overall with Scaramanga, I will say that he's definitely one of the top 10 villains, at least in the James Bond universe. Just to bring that, everything that Christopher Lee did, I don't think that if they were ever to remake this movie, I would say that, I don't know if they could do as good as Christopher Lee. They would have to do some kind of a different approach with this, and of course you'd have to, you cannot go without mentioning that third nipple on there, because that's what made Scaramanga, of course. Anyway, and his henchman, let's not forget this one. This is one that, I would say that I don't know if the producers, if this was originally in the books or not, let me know if it really was. Nick Nack, played by Herb Velichez, I believe it's how it's pronounced. Nick Nack wasn't threatening, but, his size, sometimes they will say size does matter. In this case, he was, kind of a smaller person, if you will. And, how James Bond, James Bond threatened Nick Nack in a way to the point where saying, I've never hit a midget, but there is a first time for everything. And he's like, Monsieur, and so forth. So Nick Nack was kind of like that comedy relief in there at the very end when, he's throwing the wine bottles at James Bond and James Bond puts them in the suitcase and then puts them at the top of the sailboat and so forth. That was like, okay, James Bond, I kind of see what you're doing there. Maybe it's not the approach that I wish you would have taken. Nick Nack was in no way, in my mind, threatening. If anything, he's entertaining in The Man with the Golden Gun, but I think he really didn't add anything to it. I think that they could have done without him, possibly, because Scaramanga played the part so well. I'm sorry, Christopher Lee played the part of Scaramanga so well. So I will say that. Moving on here, let's go into the movie The Spy Who Loved Me. Now, we are at like the in-between of Roger Moore's era, and, they decided to go with a villain, and to me, this is a remake of, You Only Live Twice, but beyond that, you have a new villain in here, has no ties, once again, with Spectre. You notice the trend, though, they've been going away from Spectre. We'll talk about that another time if I haven't mentioned it before. But this guy, if they couldn't have Blofeld, this is the closest thing to Ernst Stavro Blofeld that they could ever have made. He's unofficially Blofeld in my mind. Karl Stromberg, played by Kurt Jurgens. This villain, Stromberg was just like, oh my God. Something about Stromberg, of course he's obsessed with the ocean, the sea, and so forth. Stromberg's plan was to create an underwater city. Okay. Now, once you get past that, and once you look at that, it's like, that's an interesting theory. I mean, he's not out to completely destroy the world, but he doesn't want, but he still wants to have a city and create new life underwater too. His lair, this guy has pet sharks, he has a pet shark, he has a pet sea turtle and so forth. He throws his secretary in there where his shark ends up killing her because you betrayed me. Now you will pay the penalty. And, it was something about Stromberg where just, he wasn't trying to be funny, but, it was just about like the funeral was at sea. And he just pulls those sneaky little one-liners in there. And I always enjoyed him whenever I go back to this movie. Stromberg definitely very entertaining, definitely a big baddie. And he knew who James Bond was. Like I said, once again, never felt threatened by him at all. He definitely had a thing for beautiful women. We'll talk about that another time. But overall with Stromberg, though, having his plan, I always admire that. And I think even James Bond, while he never mentioned about the underwater city, I think that James Bond did, say, hey, that's an interesting plan you have there, Stromberg. But, to steal, nuclear submarines and use it against there, that's a pretty sinister plan. So I would say Stromberg might fall into the top 5 of James Bond villains for that matter. Another thing that made Stromberg so good is that he had probably the best henchman ever. It's always a tie between this guy and Odd Job with me. It is Jaws, played by none other than Richard Kiel. Jaws is probably one of the best henchmen ever because, this is where, once again, size does matter because I don't know exactly how tall Richard Kiel was, but Richard Kiel is, oh my God, he had to be at least 6'9". See, I don't even know anything about this at all, but he made Roger Moore look super small, and I don't even know how tall Roger Moore was. Now, what made Jaws is obviously the metal teeth that he had. He wouldn't just kill people by biting them on the neck like a vampire. He would also kill them. He could also kill a attack shark. So, he just did everything. He didn't have to speak. He never had any lines. He just, say, give me the microfilm, just kind of just like point and so forth, use his hand gestures and so forth, or just like stare somebody down, scare the living S out of them, and they'd hand over the microfilm, and then, he'd just kill him and so forth. He could pick James Bond right up by the neck and throw him right across the room like he did on the train scene and so forth. James Bond could shoot him with the Walther in the teeth and it wouldn't do any damage to him. Why James Bond never like shot him in the leg or shot him in the arm, besides the point though, Jaws was very entertaining. The car chase sequence that they had in there when the car goes into the barn, it blows up, and he pulls kind of a James Bond moment, if you will, and he just kind of looks at the owner while the owner's just like, oh my God, what just happened and so forth. And Jaws kind of looks back at the scene, brushes the dirt off his jacket, fixes his tie and just walks away, kind of gives like this kind of like, what are you looking at to the owner of the barn and so forth. So that's, Jaws is just, I could go all day with Jaws. I just think the character of Richard Kiel, it was a very smart move to have something like that in there. It is defines what classic James Bond or just a henchman should be. When you think of whenever I think of James Bond, Jaws, at least in the villain perspective, a henchman, Jaws always comes to mind. So there you go, Richard Kiel. And what made this henchman so interesting was that they decided to bring him back for the next one, which ended up being Moonraker. While we're talking about Jaws, he was still being Jaws and so forth. But what did make Moonraker interesting for Jaws, at least, was that Jaws did get to have one line in there, and he said, well, here's to us. And he's drinking wine, and he actually talks to a girl who doesn't talk at all either. Maybe they, have telekinetic powers or something like that. I have no idea. He ended up getting the girl at the very end. And he ended up changing sides, too, to help James Bond in the space station. Bringing Jaws back was always a great move. I don't think he was as sinister as he was in The Spy Who Loved Me, but just seeing Jaws back in there, he's chasing James Bond in the air and the parachute. They used Jaws more for comedy relief, at least in Moonraker and so forth. Like I said, I don't think he was as evil as he was with The Spy Who Loved Me. I never, even when he was trying to kill people, I was like, I don't think he's really going to kill them. I think it's just he's going to scare them and so forth. But that's about it. So, the main baddie that he was working for, though, I know he definitely killed some people in there, even if he didn't kill them himself. Hugo Drax, played by Michael Lonsdale. Like Stromberg, Hugo Drax had a plan. Instead of creating an underwater city, he decided to create a city up in space. Now, of course, this made it interesting because, he was obviously going to use nuclear weapons and so forth, or bombs that, with this poisonous gas to kill everybody on Earth, while he's meanwhile sitting with the most beautiful people in the world, or what they considered the most beautiful people in the world, almost practically all male and female models up there, and kind of doing a Noah's Ark thing, and he's going to wait and up in his space station and so forth. And, James Bond did follow him, and Drax is, I went back and watched Moonraker a couple weeks ago, and, Moonraker might not be my favorite James Bond, but boy, was Hugo Drax a great villain in there. You missed Mr. Bond. Did I? And then, now, Mr. Bond, I shall have the pleasure of putting you out of my misery. And the little, exchanges that him and Roger Moore have, and it's just like, okay, I wouldn't say that he fears 007 because he knows that he could beat 007, or at least he likes to think that he could. He had the two dogs that he would just, snap his fingers and then they would just start eating the meat. They chase the one lady into the woods and so forth. But, definitely Hugo Drax was a great villain. I really, the more I think about it, I think I would definitely rank Drax a little bit higher than I used to. All right, so moving on here with the Roger Moore movies, we move into For Your Eyes Only. I won't spend too much time on this because while I love this movie, I will say that the villains in here probably weren't my favorite. You have Aristotle Christados, played by Julian Glover, most famously from the Star Wars movies and from the Indiana Jones. Julian Glover, or Christados, he was very sinister. He's not exactly after world domination. He's after the ATAC submarine tracking system, and he's kind of more of a middleman. And that's what you find in some of these, especially James Bond movies, that, you have a villain who's just kind of like the middleman working for somebody else and so forth. And he's a murderer, he's a killer, he's very sinister, but like I said, I never thought of him, I knew James Bond at the end would have no problem, if it came to a hand-to-hand combat or some kind of confrontation between the two, I never feared for James Bond. I always knew James Bond was going to win, as he always does. So, Chris Dotto's not my favorite, and it's a pattern that you end up seeing in the end of Roger Moore's movies, just that just that villain, they're just like, he's a weaker villain. At least that's how I feel about him. He had a henchman, which I'll mention real quick, Eric Kriegler. Kriegler, in my mind, was kind of like the throwback to Red Grant. I think the best thing about Kriegler, at least, was that, the ski chase that him and James Bond had, no matter what, James Bond was trying to outrun him. Kriegler's on this dirt bike with machine guns on there, and it got to the point where they're doing the bobsled thing, and after that, Kriegler crashes, and James Bond was able to still walk away and so forth. Kriegler picks up the dirt bike and just chucks it at James Bond and practically hits him and so forth. I got a kick out of that. But overall, though, I think Kriegler was just like, well, you're a henchman, but you're not so memorable, so that you are what you are. So moving on here real quick, Kamal Khan, he was the main villain in Octopussy, played by Louis Jordan. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Kamal Khan might not be, in my mind, he's not the most memorable also, just because he was out to destroy, or he was a part of a plan anyway. He was working with General Orlov, played by Steven Berghoff. Both of them were kind of like the main baddies. You kind of have two baddies going on with this. Kamal Khan's just like, okay, well, I'm more interested in the money, but, I'm still sinister and I'm still a killer and so forth. Same with General Orlov. Orlov is trying to be, like, as Judi Dench phrased it, the next Iron Man of Russia, and he just wants to, like, take over, at least with the Russian government, take over all of Europe and, try and crush the United States and Britain and whatever else. Now, like I said, these baddies, like I said, they're not memorable, but I think the most memorable part, and I'll say this again, the most memorable scene that I remember, or I think that will be at least in the Roger Moore movie, is that the showdown Kamal Khan had with Roger Moore when they're playing backgammon in the casino, and, the double sixes and so forth. It's all in the wrist. And it's such a great scene, and I could watch that over and over again. I think one of my favorite parts of Octopussy, and like I said, probably one of the top Roger Moore moments too. Like I said, these baddies, it's just, like I said, what makes a baddie a villain to me is just like, I don't know, how, when I fear somebody or whatever, it's just like I said, these guys are just like, kind of like, okay, well, you have to have a villain, you have to have some kind of adversary for James Bond, just something that's going to keep the story moving. And in my mind, just like, they were okay. They were kind of weak. So when you move on to A View to a Kill, you have Christopher Walken, and he plays Max Zorin. Now, I will always say that, anything with Christopher Walken, you throw Christopher Walken into anything, it always makes it more interesting. Christopher Walken as a Bond villain, I never thought I would, when my dad showed me this movie, I'm like, oh my God, you didn't tell me Christopher Walken was in this, because I had already seen Batman Returns, and which we'll come back to in a moment. So I'm like, oh, well, him as a Bond villain, this is going to be really fun. And he was a lot of fun in this. And, he was psychotic, and he brought that psychotic, attitude to this. And, Walken always makes the most out of all his parts that he plays. And, he was very entertaining. He had the jokes and he had the quips in there and so forth. And, he was helped out in there by Grace Jones, who played Mayday, which was definitely one of the most interesting henchmen we will have on this list. Yes, she did take a lot of vitamins Q. She was very muscular, if you will say. And if anything that intimidates me about Mayday, it is the scene where James Bond sneaks into her bedroom, she takes off her robe, and then, how do I say this? She's, in bed with James Bond, and I'm always fearful that what Roger Moore was thinking at the time of shooting that scene. Yes, I'm sure he was very scared that something bad was going to happen. Going in with Christopher Walken, though, I think, like I said, any time that him and Roger Moore shared the screen, like, take the scene where they're, he knows he's figuring out who James Bond is. He does like the whole, taking a picture of him when they're trying to figure out the best horse for James Bond, and, the whole License to Kill. Would you prefer a horse with stamina? Maybe a little of both, and so forth. And, it was just, what made Christopher Walken, like I said, interesting is just, his attitude, his personality that he has. And, I loved every minute that he was on screen. Like I said, maybe not the best villain, but one entertaining villain, if that. So moving on here, let's go into the Timothy Dalton era. It's very short, I know. This is where villains got maybe, or at least for me, this is probably more of the weak point of villains. It's, you have Brad Whitaker, played by Joe Don Baker, who will return in a different part later on. And then you have General Koskov, played by Jeroen Krab, I believe that's how it's pronounced. Anyway, so in this, you have James Bond. He's trying to stop an evil arms dealer who's also working with the KGB, and it's a very convoluted plot in my mind. Like I said, the villains, they were there, and I never, I was never fearful of them at all. I think I was more fearful of the henchman in this, Necros. I think he was a good throwback, kind of like that whole, he could change his voice, which we've never really seen before and so forth, when he was on the radio, when he broke into kind of like a British embassy, that mansion where M and the defense minister were and so forth. He was... like I said, even when he killed the British agent when they were at the carnival and so forth, where they used that sliding door, and I was like, wow, that's a heck of a death scene there, buddy. I really enjoyed that, part of the movie when it came to the villains, but I think the main baddies in here were just still kind of weak. So finishing it up here, at least in the James Bond movies for part 1, we have A License to Kill. With this, you have an interesting villain, Franz Sanchez, played by none other than Robert Davi. This guy is, before I even go on any further, this guy is probably one of my favorite villains just because he's the most realistic that we've ever had. Once again, we always talk about world domination or what the villain's master plan is. Sanchez is not only just a drug dealer, he is a criminal mastermind. He always has a backup plan. He's very intelligent. He is, very sinister. He's a lot of things, if you will. But, he is the one that you just feel like, okay, this is where 007 could meet his match. It's not going to be a Blofeld that gets 007. It's going to be a drug dealer. And, he was just, oh my God, what he did to Felix Slater near the beginning of the movie, when he kidnaps Felix Slater, he feeds him to the shark, and he doesn't kill Felix Slater. He just, the shark takes Slater's leg, and it didn't fully take his arm, but he kills his wife and they killed him on the wedding day. It's just like, wow, oh my God, you are very not a nice person, obviously. Sanchez had a lot of great lines in there. One of my favorites is, "Today is the first day of the rest of your life." And, when you're up to your knees, you'll kiss my ass to kill you. And just little things like that. And it just, I always enjoyed the banter that they had between him and Timothy Dalton. Timothy Dalton was more of, okay, well, like I said, this could be where James Bond ends up getting killed, because James Bond was very threatened in this. I have to say, there was a henchman in here. He might not have had a lot of screen time, but he definitely became a bigger actor after this movie. In the later years, Benicio del Toro, he played the henchman Dario. He died very gruesome death, if you will. This was obviously a very bloody Bond. And then Robert Davi definitely added to that. Same with Benicio del Toro and so forth. We gave her a nice honeymoon. Yeah, cheesy line, but still he pulled it off really good. Like I said, these were definitely villains that I would say that, while it was the end of the Timothy Dalton era, I definitely think that he at least had probably some of the best villains that we've ever seen in the James Bond universe. Like I said, it wasn't about space stations, it wasn't about underwater cities, it wasn't about nuclear weapons at all. It was about Stinger missiles, drugs, and just power. And it kind of had that Scarface perspective. And the more I think about it, is that you couldn't get Al Pacino to play Scarface, but you got Robert Davi, and Robert Davi did one hell of a job. All right, so switching gears here, it ends up being around the same year, 1989. Now we move into the Batman era of villains. So on this episode, we're going to be covering some villains from the Michael Keaton, Val Kilmer, and George Clooney era of Batman movies. So one of my favorite villains, not just because it's the main adversary of Batman, it is Jack Nicholson's interpretation of the Joker. So, this, like I said, is my first Batman movie, so this always holds a special place in my heart. Jack Nicholson will always be my Joker, and for those of you, like I said, that understand what I'm saying when I say that he's my Joker. When you see a movie, you'll say, okay, well, he's my Batman, he's my James Bond, he's my Blofeld. In this case, Jack Nicholson is my Joker, just because of everything that he did with it. I mean, I don't know exactly, aside from what I've seen on the TV show about how Cesar Romero portrayed the Joker. Sorry, I didn't mention that. We'll maybe do that at another time. But with this, I will say Jack Nicholson, he was such a creepy, funny, kind of entertaining, sick, twisted, villain in this. And, he wasn't quite, he's a terrorist with this Joker, but this Joker is more kind of got the gangster feel to him and so forth. And, Jack, at first when he's Jack Napier, he's kind of that cool, oh, they're never going to touch me. They're never going to hurt me and so forth. When he encounters Batman for the first time in Access Chemicals and Batman picks him up by the shirt and by the jacket, he's like, oh my God, I think I need to check my shorts. What am I dealing with? It's a 6-foot bat. And, and then after being dropped in the chemicals, how are we going to see this interpretation of the Joker? Well, he's always smiling. He always has that, kind of look on his face, and he put the makeup on to make it look like he, looked normal, but he always had that grin on there. And as, he's having that discussion or that little meetup with, all the other gangsters and so forth. And the guy goes like, it's the guy Tony. He's like, and what's with that silly grin? Life's been good to me. And, even when the Joker, kills the guy with the hand buzzer and it ends up burning him right there and you see him lighting on fire, it's just like, how he's laughing, that he had the Joker laugh down. And that's always been my, when I hear a Joker laugh, I always think of Jack Nicholson's Joker laugh and so forth. How he was like when, he's trying to, he's having the conversation in the art gallery with Vicky Vale, and, Vicky Vale throws the water on his face like, oh, I'm melting. He's doing the Wicked Witch thing, and all of a sudden he says, boo. And then all these kind of things that he has. Where does he get those wonderful toys? You ever dance with the devil in the pale moonlight? All these quotes in there. And, down to the very end, sometimes I just kill myself. Oh, man, I want to go watch this movie right now. I'm sorry, I can't do that right now. Anyway, I got to get back on track here. The Joker, played by Jack Nicholson, is one of my favorite villains of all time in both Batman and James Bond movies. Okay, I will take that to the bank. Jack Palance was also in here, played Boss Carl Grissom in here. I love Jack Palance in this, just his attitude in here. He was worth mentioning anyway. But when him and Joker had the showdown, when Joker introduces himself, you can call me Joker. And as you can see, I'm a lot happier. And my dad and I always have that little dispute when I do the quotes from the Joker. He loves that anyway, so that's why you're getting more entertainment from this and more quotes tonight. Anyway, moving on here, let's move into Batman Returns. Now you have Danny DeVito playing the Penguin, as well as Michelle Pfeiffer playing Catwoman. I can't quote something I wanted to quote in here. We'll just say just the that we were looking for. So let's start with Danny DeVito as the Penguin. We haven't had another on-screen presence aside from this from the Penguin, if you're counting the Adam West films. We're not counting the Adam West films, that is. But Danny DeVito as the Penguin, I really enjoyed. I still go back and watch this movie, and the more I watch it, the more I love his portrayal of it, the more I come to respect it. It's hard to top Jack Nicholson's The Joker, just because not only was the Joker, it's just because Jack Nicholson played such an iconic villain. Danny DeVito's Penguin was a great villain. His quote in there, how you're just mad because I'm a real freak and you have to just dress like one, something to that extent anyway. And you don't really think you'll win, do you? And little quotes like that. And it doesn't seem like, the Penguin was ever threatened by Batman. It's just like Batman was just this pest in a way, this little rodent, if you will, in his way. And he just had to figure out a way to finally outsmart Batman. And he did have a hell of a plan when it came to actually framing him and making him a criminal, or at least getting the people to think he was a criminal. They made him look like a penguin down to the very end when he kind of spits up the black and the penguins carry him into the water and so forth. And like I said, the more I think about it, I really do love this interpretation, or this villain that, Danny DeVito did pull off. I will think that Michelle Pfeiffer almost stole the show a little bit more, not just because she looked great in black latex leather, whatever that was, and a whip. She was more, she wasn't the humor. If anything, it was the comedic relief would have been Danny DeVito, but Michelle Pfeiffer just played that dark, just role. And, she wasn't, you wanted her to end up with Batman, at least I wanted to in the end. She just played that evil role so well. And just like how, her and Batman always had that chemistry. That's what it was. The chemistry that her and Batman always had in that movie, like when they were always on screen. I mean, she gets wow, I almost said James Bond. ground. She gets Batman on the ground, and she just does like that cat lick right up his mouth into his nose. It's just like, oh my god, geez, a whiz. And down to the very end where she has the taser and how she kills Max Zorin in there. And yes, Christopher Walken is back as a villain, this time in a different movie as Max Schreck. Max Schreck was a great villain. Max Schreck is he's a very, very evil person. He's a killer. He'll push a beautiful woman, Michelle Pfeiffer, that is, off a building and not even break a sweat. And I think that makes him even more evil. And just like, Bruce Wayne, why are you dressed as Batman? Because he is Batman, you moron. And just, the chemistry that Michelle Pfeiffer and Christopher Walken had in that movie also made it a lot more fun too. Because Max Schreck is actually the one that's responsible for creating Catwoman in this movie. And like I said, I really enjoy that. Let me know what you guys think about that. Anyway, as we move on here, let's go into the Val Kilmer era of Batman movies. So when you have a new interpretation of Batman, you have a new interpretation of villains, and they become a little bit more sillier, more a little bit, I won't say lighthearted because they're still evil, but what you've had in the past two movies when you've seen like darker aspects of villains, but then you have to kind of lighten it up a little bit. Well, then you throw in Jim Carrey as the Riddler, and then you bring in Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face. And let me say this, that, when I saw Batman Forever, I still go back. I still enjoy that movie to a point, but I always look at a different perspective because of all the other Batman movies that we've had, which we'll talk about sooner. Going from Michael Keaton Batman era to Val Kilmer's Batman and the villains that he dealt with, like I said, lighthearted tone, a little bit more colorful and so forth. It was more on the lines of maybe why I just didn't watch the TV show Batman, just because I always picture Batman as just being a dark universe. And yeah, Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face, yeah, he killed people, and he was trying too hard in that role, and I could never take it just like, okay, he wasn't threatening. Yeah, he killed. The only time I felt that, he was threatening was when he killed Robin's parents at the circus. I was like, oh, okay, you're pretty bad. But after that, though, it's just like, okay, well, you're Tommy Lee Jones playing, Two-Face, but you're just, in a way, you're just being just silly Tommy Lee Jones. You're kind of showing up for the paycheck, and you sometimes see that in movies with actors, and that's definitely one just like, okay, well, he kind of phoned this in, if you will. So Jim Carrey had more fun with it seemed like. I always heard that Tommy Lee Jones, was always telling Jim Carrey to stay away from him on set and so forth because he didn't like Jim Carrey or he didn't want to be bothered by it, whatever. I could kind of see that, actually. Jim Carrey as the Riddler. Yeah, I like Jim Carrey as the Riddler because you can have Joker in here, but you kind of have more... the Joker and the Riddler to me have always kind of related in a way, just the comedy aspect in here. And Jim Carrey, is probably one of the funniest men on earth, and especially this was at the top of his game. So you get one of the highest paid comedy actors out there to play a villain in a Batman movie. And, I think Jim Carrey brought it. I really do. I really enjoy his interpretation of the Riddler. He worked with what he had, and he had the silly one-liners in there. And like I said, it's more lighthearted to that point because it's more Jim Carrey kind of humor, more kind of jokey and so forth. And, I think what made the Riddler fun for me is that, he actually broke into the Batcave, which I've never seen before anyway, and he blew up the Batmobile, he blew up all the suits and so forth, and I think Jim Carrey was never threatening, but he was always entertaining, so there you have it. So as we come to the end of the villains segment for part 1, let's talk about George Clooney's Batman and Robin. This is the one that will just always haunt us. This will always be our Star Wars Phantom Menace, the prequels, if you will. Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze. Yeah, the lines, the silly... If there was ever any time when Batman was at his silliest, or James Bond was silliest with villains, this movie takes the cake for being the silliest of silliest. It was a comedy movie. It really was. At no point did I ever feel like there was anything threatening about these villains. It was just like, okay, when's the next cheesy one-liner going to happen and so forth. Arnold Schwarzenegger doing comedy versus, whatever. And, everybody chill. And, when it comes to Arnold Schwarzenegger, I consider him more of being more entertaining when he's on screen, not so much acting. So he definitely kind of, whoever wrote this movie, Batman and Robin, just, first of all, they always deserve a good kick in the ass. But when it came to this, Schwarzenegger was funny. He had some funny lines in there, but I just don't think that, how else, though, could you create a villain such as Mr. Freeze? How else could you interpretate him when it comes to putting him on screen? So I have no idea. Maybe in the future, I know that the Gotham TV series has put Mr. Freeze on there before, but a guy, who always has to stay cold, who has an ice gun, I really don't see how much more you could really do with that. So, I don't know if I could blame Arnold for that. Uma Thurman is Poison Ivy. She was trying to be kind of the villainess in this. And like I said, more one of the cheesy one-liners that she had in there and so forth. So many people to kill, so little time, so many people to kill, those kind of lines and so forth. And she's in the middle of a fight with Batgirl. She's holding a knife and she checks herself out in the knife and just like, okay, this is where Batman has reached its low point. But besides that point, I wasn't that impressed with Uma Thurman's Poison Ivy, and don't even get people started on Bane in there because Bane was just like one silly person and just monkey business. It was played by Jeep Swenson. Nobody remembers this guy, and poor guy was going to be remembered for a bad movie. But having said that, though, we eventually get another interpretation of Bane in another Batman movie series. So that wraps it up for this Villains episode part 1. What did you think? Did the villains I mentioned make your top villain list? Who are your favorite villains? Who are your favorite henchmen? Let me know. Tweet me at Batman vs. Bond. Let me know what you think. Did I leave somebody out? Let me know about that too. So please subscribe on iTunes and or Spreaker. Make sure that you rate this show and leave a comment. Follow me on Twitter at Batman vs. Bond and Instagram, and like me on the Batman vs. James Bond Facebook page. And as you heard at the very beginning of this episode, yes, I have joined a cool little club. It is called the J-Smo Modcast, and it is a little network on there. It has a whole bunch of great shows. Check it out at jzamone.com, and you can check out all the other wonderful programming that they have on the website. So, like James Bond, I will return with Villains Part 2. Thank you for listening. Until next time, peace out, and I hope everybody has a great week. Don't forget to buy your tickets for Suicide Squad. They go on sale this Friday. Bye-bye.